Good day, all. My name is GMT Emezwe. I'm going to be your presenter in this very episode of Kanak presentation. The title of this very edition is The World of Literature and the Elements of Creative Writing, and it's being anchored by Kanak strictly or purposely for those that entered for the Kanak Creative Writing Competition, but then, of course, for all those other wonderful creative writers or people that are interested in creative writing out there. Now, our presentation is going to take this, follow this brief outline. We're going to have an introduction where we're going to discuss the world of literature, the idea of imagination, literature, and the idea of complete story, and then, of course, the treasures of literature. Then our main body shall briefly look at elements of creative writing and how it affects the treasures of literature. And finally, we have our conclusion where we'll have a kind of comparison of the treasures and then the questions and answers. Now, the world of literature is creative action, or literature essentially is creative action that involves using the human imagination to tell a complete story about an aspect of life, which captures our interest at a particular time and place in life. You know, stories are generally used to illustrate ideas that we see in life. Now, the idea of complete story comes from the fact that every literary writing or every genre of literature gives you the completeness. You know, it must have beginning and end of a particular idea, an issue, an event, or anything, whatever it is complete on its own. And you find out from the diagram we have there we have the circle, but then you see this circle is divided into 4 bits. And you find out that each bit is complete on its own, yet is an aspect of the whole. That is actually how literary writing is all about, and its relationship with the whole of life. Now, you find out that each aspect, too, has its own peculiar qualities. For instance, this is supposed to be part of a circle, but you find out that some sides of it are made up of straight lines, while the other side will have an arc. You know, so that is what we see when we look at literary writing. Now, imagination plays a very, very big part when we talk about literary creativity. On the screen, we have 3 pictures. The one on one side of it is blurred, and the blurred picture actually echoes or shows the way, you know, ideas that come to us are kind of blurred, they are not so sharp. Now, we use our human imagination to sharpen them in a particular direction. So you now find out that the blur we're looking at can actually be a complete story of life about the world of flowers and bees. It can at the same time be a complete story of life about the world of flowers, yellow flowers. You know, it can just be any of this. The important thing is that our imagination helps us to actually create vivid images and ideas about the stories that we hold. Now, this brings us to the 3 genres of literature. Simply means there are 3 different ways we can tell these stories that we tell, complete stories about life. We can tell them through what we call poetry. We can tell them through drama. We can tell them through prose. The essential thing in the differentiation of these 3 genres is that each genre has its own peculiarities. Therefore, when you're trying to tell your story of life from the perspective of a particular genre, you have to be careful that you utilize the different peculiarities of that genre very, very well. Now, the world of poetry, drama, and prose fiction is essentially evocative. It's evocative in the sense that this world touches us, it touches our feelings, it touches our emotions. And because it touches us, we now react. Consciously and unconsciously, we do this reaction. And that is how literature teaches us whatever it teaches. That is how literature changes our lives. That is how literature changes the society and the environment we're on. So it's essential we understand that this word is evocative, and what makes it evocative essentially is the story that you're telling, and most importantly, how these stories are communicated to us. So well, this takes us straight to the use of language. Language is a very, very essential element in creative writing. Language is very important and also marks one of the major distinctions in the three genres. So on our slide right now, we have the three genres, and we find out that when you talk of the nature of how language plays out, the nature of language in the three genres, in poetry, the language is highly imagistic. In drama, there's preponderance of action or events, what we call acting. And then for prose fiction, there's preponderance of narration because it's narratives that we're talking about essentially when we look at prose. Okay, now when we look at what I might call the methodology, we still talk about the majestic language of poetry, the use of dialogue in drama, or use of narratives or descriptives when we talk about prose fiction writing. Now, language has two major ways it connects. Then before we look at the two, I must say it's actually one very important one, and that is what we call the authorial language. Language that the author is using, the writer is using to tell his or her story. Now, sometimes this authorial language is direct. The author says whatever he or she wants to say directly to the audience. Sometimes this language too is conveyed through the characters. You see the author entering into the characters to still talk to the audience. These are the two major ways that language is used in literary writing. Now, when we talk of poetry, the language is mostly authorial, as I said, except in dramatic poems. Language is usually in present tense. It's always good when you're writing a poem, always use present tense, except in some peculiar situations. And then the language is highly imagistic because it relies a lot on images and adjectivals. This is also very, very important to note. And then the language concentrates mostly on verbs and nouns. So you find out that articles like there and so many other forms of this are highly used in poetry. When we look at drama, of course, the author speaks through the characters in what we call dialogue. So you see the characters saying the things that need to be said or the action, and then acting out whatever needs to be done. Now, most often the characters talk in present tense because many times when we are talking, we talk to people in present tense, except when we are reporting a past event. But outside that, it's always present tense. So stage description is also in present tense. And the authorial comments, or what we call gestures, are also in present tense. Good. So when we move to prose fiction, we now see a difference. The language of the author many times is authorial, he is there, or she is there. But then sometimes you see the authors putting words in the mouths of the characters who also express some sentiments or ideas or part of the event. Emphasis on prose fiction, the language is on narrative because it's narration that we are doing. Therefore, you concentrate a lot on past tense, use of past tense, and then use of descriptive, and then use of narrative styles. Then we're going to have an example that will show us exactly what we're talking about when we talk of language in these three genres. For example, when you look at man, it's neutral. It doesn't really communicate anything. But once you say a happy man, a sad man, childish man, you find out that you now begin to evoke feelings. It is not just the idea of man is no longer neutral. They are now giving that idea certain qualities that make it, that make us respond, resonate with us even much, much better. So if we have our example here says aggressive man in poetry. Remember, we said that poetic language is concise, limited, you don't waste words. Each single word or each single punctuation has vital things to the poem. So aggressive man, hot like Nsuka pepper, sharp as Bayo's butcher knife, Just look at that, just one example where you're trying to illustrate the idea of aggression. Now in prose, this same idea, in drama, this same idea, we're trying to dramatize an aggressive person. You find that you need to get at least two people, or even if it's one person acting out his or her aggression, so that the audience will not say, oh, this is actually an aggressive person. I mean, the person doesn't stand out and shout, I am aggressive. No, you act it out, and it's actually through the actions that people will conclude that that person is very, very aggressive. So either one person acting or two people or three people, but the idea is to show that one particular person that is aggressive. That's what we do in drama. Now, bringing this same idea to prose fiction, you'll now find out that you're going to go describing the physical qualities of this very particular man you say is aggressive, the actions, what he does that make you conclude that he is aggressive and all that. So you find out that essentially the language used in the creations actually differ. For poetry, very, very concise, you don't waste words. For drama, it's mostly about action, putting words in the mouth of characters. And then for prose fiction, is detailed narrative. The more the details, the better. Now, this takes us quickly to a very, very essential part of creative writing, which we call characterization. The ability to create characters. You are the one creating them. And you make them so real that one actually feels that the characters are they can be identified. So characterization simply, or characters, refer to the people or persons that populate the story. Good. And the art of creating the characters is what we call characterization. In poetry, a character is called a persona. Most often, in order to make our characters real, you need to give them qualities, physical qualities, just like a normal human being. You give them habits, just like people have habits. You give them psychological, emotional habits. You give details of this. That is what makes your characters very, very real. Sometimes, especially in poetry, character might not be very well differentiated. It can just be a perspective or a viewpoint, like we have those two eyes, through which the story in the poem or the feelings in the poem are being expressed. So that is one way of handling characterization, especially in poetry. In poetry, you don't have, sometimes some poems, you don't have distinctive characters. You can't differentiate them. You simply see the feelings or the ideas just coming out like that. Yes, though the characters are not distinct, but there is still characterization. The idea is coming through what we call a unified viewpoint, like eyes, that are just showing what is going on. Now, in drama and prose, most often the characters are well differentiated. And as I've said before, you talk about physical descriptions, you give them names, height, shape of body, etc. Give them emotion, give them things, before you now talk about the events, the things that they are doing. From characters, we go to another essential part of creative writing, which we call plotting. Plotting simply is the way that we arrange the events in the story. Remember, I said that literature is about telling complete story about an aspect of life. So every story is made up of a central line. That's the major idea of the story. Then you have the minor events or minor lines. So here we have on our platform, you see the central line, the yellow square. That is the central line showing the way the story is going. Now, within it, there are sub-events or minor events. And we need to arrange these events in such a way that they are captivating. It will keep our audience completely glued to what we are doing. That is very, very, very important. So you now see those other small, half squares coming up, So you actually decide the way you can arrange them. And there are different ways you can actually arrange events in your story. They have what we call the linear or chronological plot style, where you tell the stories, logically from maybe a child's childhood, adulthood, and then to old age. The things just move naturally like that. Then you also have what I call the complex plot style. And under complex plot style, we have sub-styles like what we call media res, where the story can start in the middle, the story can start at the end, the story can start at the end and move to the front and then, continue back. And there are different, these are part of complex plot styles. Now, plots also help us to divide, the essential, which major small story, minor events, to put them in categories. In poetry, this is done through what we call lines and stanzas, where major ideas are captured in certain lines or certain stanzas. Now, this broad division, when it's done in drama, we talk about acts and scenes. Each scene contains a major idea that is part of the total idea. Then in prose fiction, we talk about chapters or event breaks, major breaks, like you have short stories, so the essential thing here is for you to do your plotting very well, you need to know the central storyline and then also know the smaller or minor events that make up the main storyline. And then you now decide how you arrange them. Now, this brings us to another very essential part of creative writing, which is called setting. Setting simply means background. Just like when you take a picture and you want your picture to be prominent, you want it to show perhaps certain things about you. You find out that the background on which you place that picture becomes very, very important. Just like now I'm talking to you, you find out that my background, there are certain backgrounds I will have. It will become very distracting. Good. So, but there are backgrounds that I will have. You find that it will project myself and then help you to focus on me and what I'm saying. It is exactly the same way that it works out or plays out in the world of literature. Your setting can determine how your audience are glued to your story or the way they lose focus. So of course, in background, we have different types of setting. You can have physical setting or geographical setting, where you take time to describe the details of the location or the space or the place where that thing is happening. Good. Then you can have what we call historical setting, where maybe something took place in the past or you're trying to recreate a past. Good. So you have to go and actually talk about that past, the way people do things, maybe the actions they do that time, also the physical or geographical setting that they have at that time. All those things have to actually match themselves. We also have economic setting. So essential thing, we talk about consistency here. Then when you're trying to create a setting, if it's in prose fiction, make it as detailed as possible. If it's in drama, the same way, most often your settings in drama are known in what we call stage descriptions. In stage descriptions, the playwright takes time to actually tell you what the stage should look like, what each character should be, or what they should wear, and how they stand or sit, or what they do. This part of stage description, which is usually in present tense. Good. And then in prose fiction, in poetry, sometimes the setting is well noted. You can say that, yes, this is where the background that this thing is happening. At times, the setting is not specified. And many a time in poetry, when the setting is not defined or specified, it is taken for granted that the setting is the present time and it is wherever the audience is looking at the poem at that particular time. Point of view is a very, very essential part of creative writing. Point of view simply means perspective. The perspective from which you are seeing what the story you are telling is very, very important. Good. So the perspective from which you are telling the story can be from what we call the I. Excuse me. The personal pronoun I. That means the event happened to you. It can also be from perspective of he or she or you. At the same time, it can be from the perspective of what we call the omniscient narrator, where the author plays God, he or she sees and knows what is happening at all times in the lives of all the characters, and then reports the same to the reader or the audience. So perspective is very important. And one major takeaway we're going to have here is consistency. Always be consistent in the perspective that you have chosen. Now, titling. Titling is one very, very important area that people usually neglect. The whole essence of writing a story or telling a story, either as a poem or drama or prose, is for people to read your story. It's for people to engage with it, for people to be interested and be able to read it from beginning to end. Many times you find out that some people write wonderful stories, but they give it poor titles. So your titling is very, very important. Your title can be literal in the sense that it takes an aspect or the major theme or major idea in your story and you make it your title. At the same time, your title can be imagistic in the sense that that idea is explored through an image, and then it is this image that you now project to your reader, with the idea that it's going to hold his or her attention. So title is very, very important. We raise it here so that you actually take a good look at it when you are doing your titling. And then we come to the comparison, a brief summary of what we've been going through this slide so far. We have our elements of creative writing, which we have touched on. The idea of complete story, the nature of each genre, the language, the importance of language, characterization, the need to create good characters, setting, plot is another very vital point of view, and finally, title. And we say that when we look at poetry, poetry deals with and mostly with imagistic language, the more imagistic the better. Most of the things in poetry is realized as most of the writings are realized as present tense. And then we've talked about being precise and concise and pruning out irrelevant words in a poem. And then can tell your story, in your poem, it can come through as a unifying perspective that from which your story is told, or you can have a differentiated character, and then in terms of setting in a poem, it can be physical, where some ideas or some features are mentioned, or it can be blurred, Plotting in a poem usually comes through, as we said, first the major storyline in your poem, and then your lines, and then stanzas, which show the broad division of the sub-events. And then your point of view can be told in a poem, can be a unifying eye, or from which the experience is just narrated. And this is what most people do in their poems. And then it's important to give a captivating title. In drama, we noted that drama is essentially about acting. It's all about acting. So the language use has a lot to do with dialogue, where the characters talk to each other, and then we also have a stage description and the comments from the author, telling each character what you're supposed to do at a particular time, and of course the breakup of the action into scenes and acts, and it's important that we have a point of view well delineated, and followed through, especially most often in drama, people use the omniscient point of view. And then we also talk about giving it your drama piece, a very wonderful title. Now, prose fiction is about extended narrative, so you make use of mostly descriptions, to be able to give necessary details that will make the reader to connect with what you're writing. And we've also mentioned the fact that most narratives are done in the past tense, so you have to be consistent there. And in your characterization, make sure you create characters that the reader can connect with. You feel as if I know this person. That's actually what helps you to create a very good story, especially along the lines of what you want your reader to see in that very character. And you're always at liberty to choose any of the points of view, whether I, he, she, or omniscient, anyone. Just be consistent in what you're doing. And of course, you give your work a very, very good title so as to retain the suspense that it should have. And right now, we're going to have our questions and answers, and we invite you to ask us questions on what I've been talking about so far. But before we take the questions, may I briefly present to you the theme for the 2022 Creative Writing Competition? Yes, it is out. The theme for this year's Creative Writing Competition is Reverence for Life. And submissions are going on right now. We invite you to get your entry ready and then submit it. So we wait for your questions and answers. Thank you very much for being a wonderful audience.